Good morning, everyone. I hope that the first day of classes is off to a good start. Yes? Excellent. Good. Love that enthusiasm. Anyway, we are delighted this morning to have Ambassador Elayne Whyte kick off our Beeper seminar series. And as we were discussing during orientation, the Beeper seminar series brings together, top scholars and practitioners, from all over the world, to mostly from Europe, but from all over the world, to address themes of interest to SAIS students. And today, Ambassador Whyte has agreed to give a talk on nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and global risks. I'm sure we've got a lot of students from our global risk program here in particular, given that title. Ambassador Whyte has served as Vice Minister of Costa Rica and Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Costa Rica to the UN in Geneva. She's held leadership positions in disarmament treaty regimes, including the Arms Trade Treaty and the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and has led negotiations in the creation of global cooperative frameworks under the WHO. And so she's had a very interesting, amazing sort of experience in these general areas of cooperation, in particular in looking at the idea of non-proliferation. She's been a professor and researcher at the School of International Affairs at the National University of Costa Rica and at the Law Department at the United Nations Mandated University for Peace. She's worked for over 20 years on issues related to regional integration and development in Central America, and is author of a series of publications on regional integration, security, foreign policy, and human rights issues. So she's combining a great deal of policy experience with an academic experience. She's won many prestigious honors, including a PhD honoris clausus, and has most recently been awarded the 2019 Sean McBride Peace Prize by the International Peace Bureau at the United Nations headquarters in New York, which just came out in 2022, I think delayed because of COVID, no doubt. She holds a master's degree in international studies at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, which is where we first met. And she now sits on its board, and she's currently a fellow at Harvard University. So, Elayne, thanks so much for being here, and we all look forward to your presentation. So.
Good morning to all. I really feel privileged to be here with you and looking at the first day in which you are so full of energy and enthusiasm. And I see many faces here that I hope that I will meet down the road, and to see you leading processes, leading organizations. You are committed to finding solutions to this world's problems, which is the same thing that I've been trying to do for the last more or less 30 years since I graduated. And that road has taken me to work at the regional level, at the national level, at the regional level, and also at the global level. And of course, as I was preparing to convey the message that I want to convey to you today, there have been 3 events in the last days that really have made an impact in me. Can you hear me well? Yes, perfect, thank you. And that I wanted to share with you all, because my main reflection I'm going to be sharing with you from the perspective of a practitioner, and to give you a little bit of information and lessons learned in the process of trying to create solutions for an intractable problem like nuclear weapons. Overall, you can imagine that when we are faced with such a huge problem, I think the first thing that we need to do is to try to identify which part of the problem we are going to be tackling. Because as individuals, as one or a group of nations, we cannot solve the whole of the problem. So we have to understand and identify which part of that problem it is that we are going to own and to try to find solutions to. And in this process, I would like to also point out part of my reflections in representing a small nation like Costa Rica that at the same time has relied on international law and the rule of law and the United Nations for over 70 years when Costa Rica decided to abolish its army. The first thing I see is that the only constant in human history is change and adaptation. And although the human civilization has been around for thousands of years, we are, in this moment in history, we are working in a much more sophisticated, modern international system based on the nation state from the perspective of the Westphalian model. And it seems that we are, as the Secretary General of the UN pointed out yesterday, today's Wednesday, Thursday, right? So Tuesday, he pointed out that we seem, as the international community, we seem to be gridlocked in a platform of dysfunction that is not actually delivering the solutions that this world needs. And the first reaction that I had when I listened to his presentation before the General Assembly of the United Nations that meets for the first time after the pandemic in person. So we have hundreds of leaders meeting in New York to engage in conversations to see how we can advance the world's most pressing issues. So the first reflection that came to my mind from my years as a practitioner, where I do coincide with the Secretary General in the sense that we have at least three main challenges when we're trying to sort out and to find proper problems. The first one is the time frame. The interstate system is not delivering solutions at the pace that humanity needs to tackle the problems that we are facing, some of which are existential risks. We are making decisions to the best of our knowledge and using the best instruments that we have at hand. But we perhaps are in more need of finding more innovative solutions, innovative ways in which we can function and perhaps try to the extent possible, see how we can change the pace in which we are functioning to generate agreements at the global level. The second challenge that I find is that we are still working with the same instruments of the last 75 years and the last hundreds of years in the interstate system, which are pretty much state obligations. We negotiate treaties and state obligations, bilateral, plurilateral, multilateral, regional state obligations. And of course, international law is the pillar of the international system, but at the same time, creating international law takes time. I have estimated that the last treaties that have been negotiated at the global level take some time from at least 3 to 10 years to complete between the moment in which the agenda setting identifies that there is the need to create a new legal obligation to the moment in which that legal obligation enters into force. So 10 years is a long time for the kind of the pace of the problems that we have now. And I find a third challenge from my practice, which is the approach that we are following, which is one that we are still borrowing from a time in history, in human knowledge, that what we knew on how we knew to do things or to approach the problems was to disaggregate a very complex problem and to disaggregate it into topics that most of the time work in silos. And we used to create one single solution for every single problem. So if we had a challenge with labor, then we used to create a Ministry of Labor at the national level, or we created an international labor organization. Same with health, same with telecommunications, same with the weather. And we end up both at the national and at the international level with a web of institutions that have been created in very different times in history, that have the completely different mandates, that have a completely set of founding legal instruments, and most of the times have overlapping mandates, have overlapping administration apparatuses, and pretty much don't communicate among them. So we are in need of a more systemic thinking and more systemic action. In this regard, I think that small nations, we have a little bit of an advantage because we suffer from the resource constraints that do not allow governments in the small nations to allocate a team of experts to devote themselves to nuclear weapons or to health for 20 years and to be specialized in that topic. So most of the time, diplomats of the developing nations, of the small nations, have to cover a wide range of topics. It is a challenge so that we can actually have in-depth knowledge of the topics, but at the same time, it is an advantage because we are able to look at the different interactions and interrelations and interconnectedness of the different topics that we're talking about. So we are a little bit more open to creating more comprehensive views and approaches. But that is, I think, one of the most important aspects that we need to overcome in this time in history is to see how we can develop a systems approach that can allow us to identify the interconnections between the topics, to devise interventions that are interconnected, and to look at the forward and backward linkages of all the interventions that we are trying to solve. If we're trying to solve climate change, and we're creating incentives that are related to trade, but we are not consulting or coordinating with the World Trade Organization, we might be creating yet another problem that we're going to have to solve later on. So the silo mentality, the silo action also comes with another trend that I have seen, which is that every time we're confronted with a problem, the first reaction is to apply the same knowledge and the same instruments that we have, and not to stop to innovate. And what happens many times, as is the case with nuclear weapons, is that thinking about a systems approach, the systems tend to be in disequilibrium, because if we have insecurity because of the existence and constant reliance of certain states on nuclear weapons, if we feel more insecure, but we go on increasing the investment of nuclear weapons, in developing new technologies for nuclear terror, and increasing the number and proliferation of nuclear weapons, we are basically creating a reinforcing feedback loop. What we are seeing is efforts by the rest of the international community to see how we can create some balancing input And one of the instruments that, that follows this approach is the negotiation and entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it to you today, precisely because we are seeing one day, we are actually one day after having listened to the second time or the third time in this year in which we are hearing nuclear threats from the president of the Russian Federation. So let me just go back to the initial point. There were three events, recent events that have created an important impact for me. The first one is the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that took place in Uzbekistan, 16th and 16th of September, in which, in a meeting between the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, and President Putin, the Prime Minister of India mentioned, as is reported by the media, he mentioned to President Putin in public, today's era is not an era of war. Democracy, diplomacy, and dialogue is what help the world. And that phrase led me to bring to the present moment the legacy of the generation of the interwar period. Let us think that in a period of 31 years, there was one generation that endured World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. The destruction of these and the trauma of these events caused or made this generation a very innovative generation that created very important solutions to the world that we have inherited and we have benefited from. First of all, they created a multilateral financial system to avoid another financial instability. It created then a multilateral institutionalized system based on a constitution that is the United Nations Charter, based on norms, values, and institutions, based on the respect of human rights. And the other pillar, which is fundamental, the prohibition of the use of force as the main pillars of the international system. Except, of course, for the two exceptions that are contemplated in the UN Charter, which are the use of force for the exercise of the inalienable right of individual and collective self-defense, and situations approved by the Security Council for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. So we already know that the invasion of Ukraine really is a violation of the UN Charter and of a violation of the legacy that we have inherited from this very innovative generation. So the other aspect is the speech by the Secretary General at the inauguration of the General Assembly, in which he calls the attention of world leaders, saying, we are gridlocked and we are in a moment in which we thought that we were moving from G20 to G2, but now we are ending up with G nothing. No cooperation, no dialogue, no problem solving. How did we get here? Why are we here? But most importantly, how do we move from here? And this is where we need the current and the future generation of leaders to work together in finding innovative solutions and to try to escape this gridlock and to escape this trap of thinking about producing solutions with the same mentality that created the problems in the first place. And this takes me then to the issue of nuclear weapons, because there is no other field in which we see lack of dialogue, lack of cooperation, and lack of concrete actions more than in the field of nuclear, of the management of the nuclear threat in the world. Let us just go very briefly to the history. When the United Nations Charter was being negotiated, all the delegates knew that the war was going to come to an end, but nobody could envision that only a few weeks later, after the charter was adopted, there was going to be the start of the nuclear terror. But at the moment in which the two detonations took place in Japan, both in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the very first moment in which those detonations happened, there was a reaction and a call to include a legal prohibition of that new kind of weapon, the nuclear weapons, a legal prohibition in international law, just as other weapons of mass destruction had a legal prohibition. Not only by the International Committee of the Red Cross, not only by the victims of nuclear terror, but also by the United Nations General Assembly, because the first meeting ever that took place in the United Nations was in January of 1946. Very first decision was resolution so-called GA11 that created a committee in charge of making sure that nuclear energy was only going to be used for peaceful purposes, and that nuclear weapons were going to be abolished, completely abolished from national arsenals, although at the time only the US had developed nuclear weapons. There was a period in which both the US and the Soviet Union engaged in talks and presented proposals to prohibit and destroy nuclear weapons. But because of the dynamics that was established at the Cold War, those talks did not progress. And we were confronted with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. After that crisis, the first, let me just get a little bit of water. The first concern of that generation was that there were at least 25 countries that had developed nuclear research programs and nuclear programs that could evolve into programs of nuclear weapons. So the main concern was how to stop a world in which at least 20 or 30 parties had nuclear weapons. And this is when first my region, the Latin America Caribbean region, developed the first ever nuclear weapon-free zone treaty. We completely decided to eliminate nuclear weapons as a means of security by the establishment of the Tlatelolco Treaty that basically established the first ever nuclear weapon-free zone treaties and then it was followed by other regions in Africa, in Central Asia, in South Pacific and Southeast Asia. But a year after that, the United States and the Soviet Union proposed to the rest of the world the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. That was the great deal, the great proposal by which the rest of the world gave up the possibility of developing nuclear weapons in exchange for two deals. One of them to have access to the nuclear technology for peaceful uses. And the second one, a promise that it was included in Article 6 of the NPT, of the so-called NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that the nuclear powers were going to engage in negotiations of good faith towards a general and complete disarmament, towards a prohibition of nuclear weapons. So we started from the 60s up to the 70s, 80s and late 80s with an expansion of this norm that has now more than 190 countries that are compliant with their obligations, and we have completely given up the possibility of developing nuclear technology for purposes of war. And there is a whole machinery, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and also the treaty on the total prohibition of nuclear testings that have very important mechanisms to keep most of the world's up to accountability in those non-proliferation obligations. So when the end of the Cold War came, most of us were very hopeful that the end of the Cold War was going to generate a new kind of dynamics between the superpowers. The initial step to cut by half the nuclear arsenals between the US and Russia, so we went from 70,000 to around 35,000 in the very first years of the period after the Cold War. It just gave us a lot of hope for the achievement of a world free of nuclear weapons, which is a commitment that to which all the countries of the world have committed to. But then after 2010, progress started to stall. And not only progress started to stall, but also we started to see a movement in the opposite direction of great power competition, moving towards increasing the role of nuclear weapons in their security doctrines, in investing more heavily on producing new technology, on modernizing the arsenals, and very heavily investing resources in what we can call in a new arms race. So what do you think can be the role of the rest of the world, which actually is the solid majority of the international community? More than 122 states that have given up the possibility of participating in the nuclear terror. What instruments do you think we have at hand to deal with this issue? The first aspect that we need to take into the consideration is, are we passive observers, fence watchers? Do we take on board some agency? And if we do, what exactly can we accomplish? Because we don't own the arsenals and we cannot destroy them. So what can we do? So the first proposal that came to the table around 2010 was to move on to the establishment of a legal prohibition of nuclear weapons that would help in stigmatizing and delegitimizing nuclear weapons. And by this norm, the norm in international law, to help in making progress in norm development and in somewhat causing some impact in the behavior of states and different actors in society. So this is when I want to come to, I don't know how I'm doing with time. Okay, perfect. So let me start by sharing a short video that comprises what the problem is today, what the problem is that we need to tackle today. So let me see. Is this the one I know? The other one? It's just hidden nearby. That one.
14,000 nuclear bombs in the world, thousands of which are ready to be used in an instant. Most are far more powerful than those that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Since then, nuclear weapons have almost been used many times because of malfunctions, mishaps, false alarms, and misunderstandings. In 1995, for example, a research rocket launched to study the Northern Lights was mistaken for a nuclear missile and led the world to the brink of destruction. We know a nuclear explosion would lead to a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Yet the risk that nuclear weapons are used is higher today than it has been in decades. Military incidences involving nuclear states and their allies are happening more and more often, and states are making explicit threats to use nuclear weapons. Agreements to eliminate existing arsenals are being abandoned as new nuclear weapons are being developed. We are on a dangerous path towards a new nuclear arms race. At the same time, digital technologies that now control nuclear weapons could be hacked to issue a false warning of an impending attack, or even worse, access the launch codes. The official line is that having nuclear weapons keeps us safe, yet the reverse is true. As long as nuclear weapons exist, there is a risk they can be used. All states must join the Nuclear Ban Treaty now and bring the nuclear weapons era to an end.
So this is where I come in the equation as a practitioner. I was appointed as ambassador of Costa Rica to the United Nations in 2014. And in 2016, the United Nations General Assembly decided that it was the time, after 72 years, to convene already a conference, a diplomatic conference that negotiated a legal prohibition of nuclear weapons. We can engage in a conversation later on, but what do you think was the reaction of the nuclear weapon states? Not only did they not sign it, but they were very opposed to this idea. Which, of course, at some point, a narrative was created that this treaty was of no use because it was not going to eliminate one single nuclear weapon, they said, because we are the ones that hold the nuclear weapons. Why do you want to go and prohibit them? What use is it going to produce? What impact, really? But what makes this very, very interesting is that the international community was able to create a multi-stakeholder coalition that brought together scientists, civil society, citizens from all over the world that were concerned about the humanitarian consequences of any explosion of nuclear weapons, of any nuclear explosion. Scientists, activists, civil society, academia, and very importantly, the voice of the victims. And this was one of the most important lessons to me in my life, was to be able to get to meet people that had survived the bombings of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, that have devoted their whole lives and have waited for 70 years to see a legal prohibition of nuclear weapons, and they never gave up telling their stories and what exactly means for a human being to be submitted to a ionizing radiation of this sort. But also I was in touch with the survivors of nuclear testings all around the world, in the Pacific and in Central Asia. And the stories that are told are really, really horrible. So this multi-stakeholder coalition was very powerful. And they decided that human being and his relation to nature need to be placed at the center of the security, of the national security. And as the then president of the International Committee of the Red Cross mentioned, the concerns of the state, of the nation states, need to yield to the interest of humanity. We cannot have 13,000 nuclear weapons, around 3,000 of which are in state of alert and can be triggered in a matter of minutes. But what is even more interesting is that this coalition of states did not take this discussion outside of the United Nations framework, but what they did was to used the same United Nations framework and the same mandate that was adopted in 1946 to get rid of nuclear weapons and consolidate a world free of nuclear weapons, to generate a strategy that ended up in this negotiation. In addition, they started to think outside of the box. And when I say to think outside of the box, I mean that for decades, even my country was engaged in proposing big nuclear weapon conventions. They would try to bring all the parties together and to solve all at once the issue of nuclear weapons, and nothing had really made progress. So there was a new theory of change. And the new theory of change was, let us study the current evidence, scientific evidence that we have about what exactly it is going to mean, or exactly what the impacts are of a nuclear detonation today, with the knowledge and the scientific knowledge that we have today. And with that, they realized that the consequences, the humanitarian consequences because of the destruction of the environment and the impossibility of any single state, any single actor to deliver appropriate response to any nuclear detonation, because of the destruction of the impact in human health, in agriculture, in water, animals, all the environment, and of course, the disproportionate impact that ionizing radiation has had on indigenous peoples, and very important, on women and girls. And this is studies that have been collected throughout last decades, that actually ionizing radiation has a larger, much graver impact on the women's bodies. They decided then to make use of the powers of the General Assembly, where the veto power, that nobody has a veto power to stop collective action. And this is when, by a coalition of small states and regional powers, a resolution was introduced, and I will tell you a little bit more about the process. A resolution was introduced to obtain a very strong mandate by the General Assembly to engage in these negotiations in 2017. And this is when I want to share with you this other, there you go. Has anyone been exposed to the way in which the UN makes decisions in committees and General Assembly? So you will find this familiar, but for those who don't, this was how the third committee that deals with disarmament and security adopted the mandate to negotiate a legal prohibition of nuclear weapons in 2016, October 27.
The committee will now proceed to take action on draft resolution L41 entitled Taking Forward Multilateral Nuclear Disarmament Negotiations.
The voting machine is unlocked. Delegations are kindly requested to indicate their votes on the board. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the board?
The result of the voting is as follows: 123 in favor, 38 against, 16 abstained. Draft resolution L41 is adopted. There should be cheers for all resolutions, not only this one.
So again, I just wanted to give you a sense of the kind of energy, enthusiasm, and hard work.
Sorry, you stopped the share, so the students online can't see it. So, we have people attending also online, so I want them to see it too.
I wanted to give you an impression of what the atmosphere was to be able to obtain this negotiation mandate. It was the first time in the history of the United Nations that any process of this sort was triggered with, despite the opposition of the P5, of the permanent members of the Security Council, and therefore the most powerful nations on earth. And this is when exactly I as a practitioner come into play, when I was asked to chair these negotiations. It was, of course, a great honor to be able to facilitate a process of this sort that put me in touch with these human traits that are so fundamental as courage, perseverance, strategic perseverance, and just the search for the human security. But let me tell you just very briefly how we got here, because it was not, I mean, whatever you saw in that voting was the result of a process of at least 10 years. In 2010, it was the first time in which a group of countries started to change the narrative and to change the analytical framework with which nuclear weapons were being analyzed, from instruments of state security to instrument of risk for humanity, and putting the human being at the center and creating the so-called the humanitarian impact analytical framework. There were three diplomatic conferences that brought together states, scientists, activists, and also victims that very thoroughly analyzed little by little the scientific evidence that we have today about any impact of nuclear weapons, and found that because of the terrible humanitarian impact, nuclear weapons should never be used again under any circumstances. And that the only way in which we can protect humanity from the risk of nuclear weapons being used again is their total elimination. We now see that as long as nuclear weapons exist, and they are in the hands of leaders that can very freely make decisions either to threat to use them or to actually use them, we realize that the risk is real. So a new conceptual paradigm was created, as I said, from the orthodoxy of state security to a new analytical framework that puts the human being and the planet first. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a new strategy that was created little by little within the framework of the United Nations, with resolutions that started in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2016, 2015, 2016. Many times you wonder why resolutions at the UN are repeated every year, but they're not exactly the same. They have little adaptations that allow for a topic to be further developed with each year. There were two open-ended working groups that discussed in more details exactly what could be done. By then, it was not clear that we were going to move to a legal prohibition of nuclear weapons. But in 2016, an open-ended working group that functioned out of Geneva came to the conclusion that the General Assembly needed to receive a recommendation to move towards a legally binding instrument that prohibits nuclear weapons. Then the negotiation conference worked in 2017. Was convened as a diplomatic conference under the auspices and legitimacy of the United Nations. by overriding the intra-system paralysis, because there is a conference on disarmament that is that its rules of procedure include the right of veto, that is a body that functions on the basis of consensus. So the only body within the UN that functions on the basis of majority rule is the General Assembly, and this is why the General Assembly made that decision to convey this negotiation conference that was to work with the rules of procedure of the General Assembly to avoid veto. There was a lot of support, more than 3,000 scientists, more than 100 NGOs participated, and of course, more than 130 states attended the conference. As a result, the treaty was adopted on 7th July 2017 by a vote of 122. So we missed one after, so we kept the coalition intact. It entered into force in January of 2021 with the 50th instrument of ratification. And the first meeting of state parties was held in June of this year. So what are the main provisions? I would usually call for 5 blocks of understanding of what the treaty really contains. First of all, it contains this new conceptual framework to deal with nuclear weapons, as again, not as instruments of state security, but a framework that is based on the interest of humanity and the interest of the human being. So the humanitarian impact paradigm is stated in the treaty, especially in the preambular section, and there are links to other bodies of international law. Why is this important? Because we have international human rights law, international environmental law, international humanitarian law that regulates the conduct of the parties in hostilities, and nuclear weapons seem to have been somewhat isolated from the rest of the bodies of law that the international community had been creating for 70 years and more. Then there was the treaty contains linkages with the rest of the legal architecture, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, also the treaties that establish nuclear weapon-free zones in 5 regions in the world, and the treaty that established the total prohibition, the comprehensive prohibition of nuclear testings. It has a strong and comprehensive prohibition. I will explain in the next slide. It provides also pathways towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons in the case that a nuclear weapon state or a state that is hosting nuclear weapons decides to join the treaty. It also has a very important innovation that includes provisions for victim assistance, and it's the first time, believe me, that in international meetings, the victims of nuclear violence are heard. And also the obligation towards environmental remediation when nuclear explosions have happened. And we also created, in speaking about instruments, we created the concept of a meeting of state parties that with reinforced capacities to continue on developing the regime by decisions or by additional protocols that are to be adopted by the meeting of state parties. Let me just let's move here to Article 1, the clear, strong, and comprehensive prohibition. So the treaty establishes a prohibition to develop, test, produce, manufacture, acquire, possess, stockpile nuclear weapons or nuclear explosive devices. It is also prohibited to transfer to any recipient whatsoever nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices, or to transfer the control over such weapons or explosive devices directly or indirectly, like nuclear sharing policies, like some there are in some arrangements within the NATO alliance, would not be allowed with this treaty. It is prohibited to receive the transfer or control of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices directly or indirectly. And this also very important, to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. But of course, this is a prohibition that is already contained in Article 2, paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter. Just overall, the prohibition of the use of force. It is also prohibited to assist, encourage, or induce in any way anyone to engage in any activity prohibited to a state party under this treaty. And this is very important because in the concept of assisting, encouraging, or inducing, there is a whole financial system that has been impacted by this treaty, and that you will see a little bit later on. And it is also prohibited to seek or to receive any assistance in any way from anyone to engage in any activity prohibited by the treaty. And also, it is prohibited to allow any station, any installation, or deployment of any nuclear weapons or explosive devices in the territory or any place under the jurisdiction of control of any state party. So if any state that currently possess nuclear weapons or have them stationed in the territory all of a sudden decides to join the treaty and become a nuclear weapon, a non-nuclear weapon state, Articles 2 to 4 establish the pathway or the pathways to do so. First of all, they have to commit to remove nuclear weapons immediately out of operational status and destroy them as soon as possible in a time frame to be determined by the first meeting of state parties. The time frame was decided. What do you think could be? If we have 13,000 nuclear weapons today, what do you think could be a reasonable time frame to be able to eliminate nuclear arsenal of 6,000 or 500? Well, what they did was to consult with the scientists, and we asked the scientists, according to the evidence of the way in which the U.S. and Russia and other nuclear weapon states have destroyed their nuclear weapons, because first we had the initial reduction, but also on a constant basis, the nuclear weapon states have modernized their arsenal. So the scientists recommended that a time frame that is reasonable is 10 years, but that there can be an extension of 5 more years should any impediment. But 10 years is more than enough, according to the rate that has been recorded in the process of elimination of nuclear weapons in the US and in Russia. Then they have to submit to the meeting of state parties a legally binding plan with a specific deadline for the verified and irreversible elimination of the nuclear weapons, including the elimination or the irreversible conversion of all facility related to nuclear weapons. And they also have to collaborate with the competent international authority for the verification process of this destruction process. And this is something that is of interest for the whole of humanity, because up to now, all the process of dismantling nuclear arsenals have been conducted by the nuclear weapon states, by means of mutual controls, and really the international community doesn't have access to that information. So there isn't that much transparency, and there could be an evolution towards a transparency system that can be a global public good for the security of all humanity. There are other provisions, national implementation. Countries have to take measures at the national level for the implementation of these prohibitions. Let me cite a very simple example. We in Costa Rica have a pension system, and the pension funds need to invest somewhere. So our national legislation need to include a specific prohibition so that the national pension fund is not directed towards investing in financial institutions, funds, or research activities that are engaged in nuclear production. So we have also provisions for victim assistance, environmental remediation, international cooperation, and Article 8 regulates all the enhanced functions of the meetings of state parties. So up to now, we are working with pretty much the same knowledge for the building of for the building of legal regimes that have meetings of state parties and every time review the compliance of the parties. But I would like to mention then some critical elements that I think have determined the success of this process. First of all, the convergence of the aspirations. It is the aspiration of the majority of the international community to move towards a world free of nuclear weapons, because the risk is way too large to have arsenals in the hands of human beings that are pretty much free to make those decisions. There are no guardrails for that. There were deep ethical and human convictions in the process, and the fact that the victims were present in that process really gave us a very strong mandate that we could not fail in these negotiations. And this is why the role of the victims is not only important for this process, but any other future process of international addressing any global problems. The role of science is fundamental. It has been fundamental, and together, as well as in climate change, we need to strengthen the interface between science and policy and decision making. And one of the aspects that I feel very proud of is that the first meeting of state parties, one of the decisions that they took in June was to establish a scientific advisory board that is going to continue on helping the countries, because actually at the same time we are non-nuclear weapon states. We don't have the specific knowledge of many technical details. So we have a scientific advisory board. We have the strength of the support coalition. As you saw, 123 states voted for the mandate, 122 states voted in favor of the treaty. We provided for an innovative structure of the conference and a different approach to treaty making. Most of the times when you see a conference of this magnitude, there is a negotiation based on a proposal of a text that the president puts on the table. But what we did in this negotiation was that we started with some sort of an academic event. So a whole week in which we allowed all the delegations to share their aspirations about the content of the treaty. And that allowed the presidency in that moment and the team to see where the great convergence was in the room. And if we go to the theories of negotiation, this is when we identified the zone of potential agreement. That was a very important zone. And so every time that I presented a proposal to the conference, it was on the basis of the potential agreement on what I perceived to be the convergence in the room. So we had no brackets in the text, which allowed actually for a speedy negotiation. So the current status is we have at the moment 86 signatories and 66 state parties. News is that this week we're going to have 5 new signatories and 2 more state parties. So more than 90 signatories and 68 state parties. The citizen movement that worked with states to trigger this process was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And an aspect of impact that has been documented by this organization, as citizens organization, has identified that the stigmatization and the delegitimization of nuclear weapons has started to render some results. In 2021, they were able to document there was a drop of 63 billion in investment in nuclear companies, and then 127 financial institutions stopped investing in these 25 nuclear weapon producing companies. And to finish, I would like to really convey to you a call to awareness and action. Because we are in 2022, and in 2045, that is our generation and your generation, we are going to be commemorating the 100th anniversary of the start of the nuclear era. My first thought is, what will that day look like? First of all, will we have survived? Will we have continued being lucky that no new nuclear explosion has happened? Will we have used our human agency to control the technology that we create and not to perish by it? What each one of us in this present generation will have done to secure the future of humanity from the most destructive creation of humans, of the human species? I hope that we will all have taken the right decisions, spoken to our leaders, include nuclear weapons as one of our citizens' concerns, and raised our voices to demand an end to the nuclear terror. And in that regard, let me finish by recalling the quote of Pope Francis when we were about to start the negotiation of this new treaty. He mentioned that the diplomatic conference was mandated to negotiate a treaty inspired by ethical and moral arguments. And the ultimate goal of the total elimination of nuclear weapons constitutes both a challenge, but also a moral and humanitarian imperative. He stressed that humanity has the freedom, the intelligence, and the capacity to lead and direct technology, to place limits to our power, and therefore to the power of the technology that we create, and to pull all of this at the service of another type of progress, one that is more human, social, and integral, and therefore more conducive to structural peace. So I would like to invite you and to leave you with these thoughts. Human species does have the pressing need to control the technology that we create as a species. We need to constantly adapt and innovate on mechanisms and instruments and the toolbox that we have as international community. And we do need to take on board the reality that the nuclear risk is real. And yesterday it was only a demonstration that in any moment we can wake up to the news that a nuclear detonation has happened because of an accident or because of the decision of a leader. So I want to leave you with that. Please enjoy this new semester. And while you are deep diving into all the interesting topics that you're going to be studying, try to understand that we need to innovate and try to identify new ways in which we can solve humanity's problems, and we count on you for that. Thank you very much.
I think that I thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. And I think it's actually a great idea to ask them to solve the problem. Right, since our generation has not been very good at it, at least mine.
Not too fair, huh?
Yeah. Anyway, we have about 18 minutes for questions. So I'd also like to invite questions from those of us that are tuning in from Zoomlandia. I think there's one question, but why don't we take a few from the floor to start out?
1 second. Okay.
Thank you very much for being here, Ambassador. My name is Omar, and I'm from Jordan. So you spoke about possible systemic solutions to the problems that are facing humanity. But I see that more and more the major players that might actually be influential in providing a systemic solution have no confidence in each other or with the system, and have no incentive to actually give each other any kind of win because of a zero-sum kind of mentality. So how do you see, as a practitioner, a possible solution to that? And also, do you see out of the back of this kind of nuclear prohibition treaty some kind of non-aligned movement that might pop up like in the 1960s, that might actually exert some real pressure on the major players to be able to actually do something effective like this treaty? And maybe actually just a comment, such a movement might be much more influential today because the countries that we're talking about are much more economically powerful than they were in the 1960s. So I was wondering about your thoughts.
Why don't we take a few more and then we'll answer them in bunches.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm from Ireland. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for all your words and your work on the TPNW. So there exists right now quite a significant taboo against the use of nuclear weapons since 1945 anyway, which the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is both a part of and a reflection of. How do you think we can translate that on their use into real pressure on nuclear armed states to make meaningful steps towards reduction and ultimately disarmament?
I think Professor Hall in the back.
Where is she? Okay.
Thanks so much. I had a question about building on Omar's initial question about how we can imagine what it is more systematic thinking in global governance. And as somebody who's worked at the UN as a state representative for Costa Rica, what could you imagine in terms of state government machinery to enable states to monitor many different international organizations and agreements simultaneously? Because what I understand is most often what happens is the state sends a representative like yourself to one treaty, UNEP in Nairobi, or to WHO, and they're different parts of the government department. And it's very hard to think systematically, like you're saying, for a government, because they're having to parcel out different experts in different areas. Hence the problem you described of, say, climate being dealt with one person, trade by another person, health by another person. So I wondered if that kind of conversation has been happening either in Costa Rica or in other government departments you're aware of.
Well, actually, when I left the UN, I was left with these concerns. First of all, that almost nobody is thinking in systems. And this is one of the reasons why I have been taking courses on systems thinking and system dynamics, and so that I can help with new generations to create a new approach that can help both at the national, but also at the international level. But I think this is part of the, President Kennedy used to say that each generation has one great challenge to address. And I think this creation of a new way of thinking is part of the great challenge of this current generation. We are not going to generate the adaptive work or the adaptation that we need as humanity if we don't move on to a systemic approach. But it's not being created as such. And in my experience in Geneva, there was a very important effort, because the first platform that we have at this moment that would allow us to at least have systemic action in the UN is the 2030 Development Agenda and the SDGs that actually are the programmatic umbrella for all the institutional framework of the UN to function under the same objectives. And in Geneva, there was an innovative process called the SDG Lab, which is an interesting, so you know about the SDG Lab? Okay, so it's a very interesting approach to start making all the organizations see their work in systems and subsystems according to the way in which they are related to the SDGs. And to start having in all the boards and the meetings of state parties and the general assemblies of each international organization to have at least an analytical platform to start to see how the implementation of the SDGs for that organization relate to the implementation of the SDGs with other organizations in the Geneva environment. So that is step by step, not nuclear disarmament, but by step, just creating of experiences. I would then relate to the issue of please help us in this process when you're trying to analyze problems and diving into the different areas of expertise. Try to consider how we need to make and establish bridges and just problem-solving approaches. Now, on the issue of the non-aligned movement, the possibility of how to increase the taboo on the use. And I forgot to mention, this is something that is, I think, very relevant, that the coalition of states that led, the core group of states that led this process was comprised of, in Latin America, Mexico and Brazil, in Europe, Ireland and Austria, in Africa, South Africa and Nigeria. And then the core group also incorporates some countries in Southeast Asia. I have a concern in two dimensions. The first one is that in the developing world and in non-nuclear weapon states, because we have already given up the possibility of using nuclear energy for purposes of security, this has somewhat exited the policy framework in the policy discussions. And most of the times, the issue of nuclear security is left to the foreign policy apparatus, and it's not part of the discussions. So that is one concern. The other concern is that sometimes states believe, as actually was my case when I was studying my career in international relations, that nuclear weapons are an integral part of the great power agenda, and many countries feel disenfranchised to taking part in this discussion and demanding the real progress in nuclear disarmament and real progress in transparency and real progress. We don't even know, for instance, if any of our cities are being targeted. And what I'm saying is precisely because non-nuclear weapon states have requested for 7 decades to have legally binding security assurances that nuclear weapon states are not going to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. And the case that we are seeing in Ukraine has also raised the concern. So I have the concern that you have not heard, for instance, from yesterday, even though there is the General Assembly, the high level segment of the General Assembly is taking place, I have not seen a strong condemnation of the threats, of nuclear threats, by the rest of the countries. And to the extent that we fail to raise our voices and put pressure on the nuclear weapon states, the taboo is not going to be strengthened but undermined. But I think this is a call for all of us, because there is no other way to go. And there are no other instruments when the only thing that we have is voice and vote.
We have a question online that perhaps I should read as everyone else sort of prepares their own questions. Doesn't the use of artificial intelligence for the command and control of nuclear weapons create a growing risk for the world and a new urgency for eliminating nuclear weapons? As a first step to reduce these risks, should we have a treaty to ban the use of short and long range missiles for nuclear weapons?
Well, currently there are discussions addressing the application of artificial intelligence in weapon systems overall, and there are working groups that are trying to address the issue of lethal autonomous weapons. That's the killer robots and the use of technology that can make decisions on the use of force against human beings or specific material targets. But it is indeed a destabilizing factor that the introduction of artificial intelligence mechanisms in the command and control systems of the nuclear weapon arsenals is a destabilizing factor in international security. So the first thing that we need to bring together is a world discussion about the application of artificial intelligence in war systems. Overall, are we comfortable enough with introducing these automatic processes and having human beings rely more on automated processes to make these decisions? I think that is, before deciding on long or short range missiles, I think the overall discussion that humanity needs to undertake is to what extent we are actually going to cede the power of making decisions of life and death and the use of force.
I think we have time for at least one more question if someone has one. If you can keep them short, then maybe we can get to both.
I actually had two, but okay. Thank you for being here, Ambassador. I really believe that your presentation was truly inspiring. And my name is Peter. I'm originally from Russia, and my question is if there's been any sort of debate among international law practitioners the actual enforcement of nuclear non-proliferation.
Okay, and should we do one more and then?
Hi, I'm Daniel from the UK. Thank you very much for your time. I was wondering about the treaty itself, whether any signatories left reservations and any like controversies when you have like these big holistic and forward-thinking treaties. Sometimes there's doubts from parties with different interests, and also whether you know of any like compromises made in the drafting process for the treaty.
So let me start with this last question. Let's see. No, the treaty does not contemplate the possibility of making reservations at all. And yes, there were many compromises, because at the end, all countries want, they go to the negotiation table with you know, their list of demands, and some countries wanted, you know, to see, for instance, a specific inclusion of the prohibition of transit, and that was not able to be included, or the specific mentioning of financing activities. But then there was a compromise, because the issue of the word assistance to activities that are prohibited in the treaty in a general format does include the issue of financing. So there were, as you know, negotiations, compromises. Usually what is very interesting is at the last session of the treaty, when the treaty is adopted, most nations develop their statements, and in those statements they express their understanding, first their aspirations and their understandings, and how they are approaching the treaty text. So it is important to see, and even you can listen to the expression by the Netherlands, who was the one that requested the vote. Sweden or Switzerland, that also had all countries actually pretty much took the floor. But you can actually look for those expressions to see how they frame their their approaches and their preferences to the treaty text overall. Now, the other question in terms of how to improve the enforcement of the obligations of non-proliferation, but I would like to know if you're referring to only non-proliferation or to disarmament. Okay, because in the case of non-proliferation, actually, I think it's a very good success story, because most countries in the world are compliant with the non-proliferation obligations. We submit our reports, we are monitored, and we are submitted to all the accountability mechanisms of the protocols of the International Atomic Energy Agency. There is also which I think also the functioning of regimes have to follow a more systemic view, so that the compliance with treaty obligations can be reinforced among regimes. There is also the compliance with the obligations vis-a-vis the CTBT, which is the comprehensive prohibition of nuclear testing. And actually, I don't know if all of you know that this system that we have that allows us to monitor earthquakes all over the world is the one that was established precisely to be able to monitor nuclear testings. So we have technology that was actually created for some non-proliferation purposes to be applied and used for other humanitarian purposes and scientific purposes. So, and then there is also the nuclear suppliers group, and those are components of the system that very much interact with each other, because this is not like a country X like Costa Rica all of a sudden wants to go and buy enriched uranium from any source, and then nobody's going to notice. So the system of control is very well established, I think, for non-proliferation. But on the issue of disarmament is where we would need to make progress, because the cases that we know so far have been pretty much developed by the nuclear superpowers, and we only listen to the reports and their statements, but we don't have like an international mechanism to monitor and for nuclear disarmament verification, which for many parties it should be a global public good to have a universal, transparent international verification mechanism. So hopefully we will get there someday.
Okay, thanks so much, Ambassador White. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so apologies to those of you who still have questions and those who have submitted questions online. But again, please join me in thanking Ambassador White for a very stimulating presentation.
I like this.
Yeah, that's sorry.